The year is 1884. In the ballroom of the Reichstag, maps of Africa are spread across mahogany tables like a feast waiting to be carved. But the chairs reserved for African delegates are not empty, they are filled. King Cetshwayo of the Zulu nation sits at the center of the table, his advisors flanking him in military dress that blends European tailoring with Zulu beadwork. Beside him, Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia studies the maps with the calm intensity of a man who has already defeated two European armies on his own soil. And across the room, representatives from the Asante Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, and the Kingdom of Dahomey occupy positions that, in our timeline, would never have been offered. This is the Berlin Conference of 1884, but it is not the Berlin Conference we remember. The divergence began 5 years earlier, in 1879, when the British Army marched into Zululand expecting a swift victory. They did not expect Isandlwana to echo across the world the way it did. The Zulu victory was not merely a military defeat for Britain, it was a psychological earthquake. News of the battle reached Cape Town, then London, then Paris, then Berlin. And in the courts of every European capital, a question began to circulate that had never been asked before. What if Africa could not be taken? The British retreated, regrouped, and considered a second invasion. But the cost, in lives, in treasure, in political capital, gave Chancellor Bismarck pause. He proposed a different solution. A conference, not to divide Africa, but to recognize its existing powers as sovereign states, with borders guaranteed by European treaty. And so, in December of 1884, the delegates gathered in Berlin.
But this time, the African kingdoms sent their own representatives. Imagine the scene. The chandeliers of the Reichstag ballroom cast warm light on faces that had never before sat at the same negotiating table. Translators moved between languages, isiZulu, Amharic, Twi, Hausa, French, English, German. The air smelled of coffee and tobacco, and the tension of empires meeting as equals for the first time. The treaty that emerged from Berlin, the Treaty of Mutual Recognition, established something unprecedented. African kingdoms were recognized as sovereign states under international law. In exchange, they agreed to end the internal slave trade, to open diplomatic missions in European capitals, and to grant European merchants access to their markets under regulated terms. The slave trade, which had ravaged the continent for centuries, did not end overnight, but it ended within a generation. The European demand for slaves collapsed when the legal mechanisms that enabled it were dismantled, and the African kingdoms, now recognized as sovereign, had the legal standing to enforce their own borders against slave raiders. The decades that followed were not peaceful. There were border disputes, succession crises, and moments when European gunboats threatened to undo everything. But the template had been set. Africa would modernize on its own terms. In the Ethiopian highlands, Emperor Menelik II, who succeeded Johannes in 1889, did not need to fight the Italians at Adwa. The Italians never invaded. Instead, Ethiopian engineers traveled to Germany and France, returning with blueprints for railways, telegraph lines, and factories. By 1900, Addis Ababa had electric streetlights.
By 1910, it had a university where students studied astronomy and law in Amharic. In the forests of West Africa, the Asante Empire built a network of railroads connecting Kumasi to the coast, exporting gold and cocoa under their own flag. The British maintained trading posts at the coast, but they did not rule. Asante diplomats in London wore kente cloth in the halls of Whitehall, and they were received with the same protocol as ambassadors from any European power. In the Niger River Basin, the Sokoto Caliphate, already a sophisticated Islamic state with a written constitution and a system of courts, became a center of learning and trade. Hausa merchants traveled across the Sahara and the Atlantic, their caravans carrying leatherwork, textiles, and manuscripts. The libraries of Sokoto grew to rival those of Timbuktu, filled with works in Arabic, Hausa, and Fulfulde. And in southern Africa, the Zulu nation under Cetshwayo and his successors transformed from a military kingdom into a constitutional monarchy. They adopted a written constitution in 1897, established a parliament, and built schools where Zulu history was taught alongside mathematics and engineering. The Zulu king remained a revered figure, but power shifted gradually toward elected councils. What did daily life look like in this world? Picture a merchant in Lagos in the year 1910. He walks through a marketplace where goods from 4 continents are displayed under canvas awnings. British cotton cloth hangs beside Yoruba-dyed indigo. German rifles are sold alongside Benin bronzes. The merchant conducts his business in Yoruba, English, and Portuguese, switching between languages as easily as he counts his money. He pays taxes to the Alafin of Oyo, not to a colonial governor.
When he has a dispute with a European trading partner, he takes it to a mixed court in Lagos, where African and European judges sit together.
This was not a utopia. There were inequalities, corrupt officials, and periods of drought and famine. The European powers still exerted enormous economic pressure through trade agreements and debt. But the fundamental relationship was different. African leaders governed African lands. African children learned African history. African languages were the languages of power. The 20th century unfolded differently. When World War I broke out in 1914, African kingdoms declared neutrality or chose sides based on their own calculations. Ethiopian troops fought alongside the Allies in Palestine. Zulu diplomats mediated between the British and the Germans in East Africa. The war was shorter, and its aftermath did not include the redrawing of African borders. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Africa hard, commodity prices collapsed, and the terms of trade shifted against the continent. But African governments, unlike colonial administrations, had the authority to implement their own economic policies. Some imposed tariffs, others formed regional trade blocs. The Pan-African Economic Union, established in 1938, was the first of its kind, a continent-wide agreement to reduce barriers between African states. By the 1950s, Africa was not a collection of struggling post-colonial states. It was a continent of established nations, each with its own trajectory. Some were monarchies, some were republics, some blended traditional governance with modern institutions. The technological gap between Africa and Europe was real, but it was narrowing. African universities produced engineers, doctors, and scientists.
African factories manufactured textiles, processed minerals, and assembled machinery. The space race of the 1960s had an African dimension. Ethiopia launched its first satellite in 1967 using a rocket built with German assistance and launched from a site in the Somali desert. The satellite was named Lalibela after the rock-hewn churches of the highlands. It transmitted weather data and communication signals across the continent, connecting villages that had never before been linked by wire. And so, as the 20th century drew to a close, Africa entered the new millennium as a continent of 50 sovereign states, each with its own flag, its own capital, its own seat at the United Nations. The scars of the slave trade were still visible in the empty villages of Angola, in the depopulated regions of the Congo Basin, in the diaspora communities of Brazil and the Caribbean, but the wound had been allowed to heal rather than being reopened generation after generation. The world we live in today, our world, is one where Africa was divided, exploited, and reshaped by foreign powers. The consequences of that division are still unfolding. But in this alternate timeline, the question is not what Africa lost, it is what Africa built. If you enjoy exploring these alternate timelines, subscribe